everyone, and welcome back those of you who are joining by Zoom. Good to have you here this morning. So we've been touching on some of the main points that I tried to raise throughout the first 3 chapters of Contemplating Christ. Looking first at maybe we could say the grammar of the contemplative life as it's grounded in Scripture and even in doctrine in the first chapter. We looked at those constellation of texts. And then we started exploring some of the thematic understanding of exile and exile interrupted, using the myth of Eden, as it were, and then exploring some biblical texts, particularly in the New Testament. We looked at the prodigal son story as a kind of retelling of Eden through this revised understanding of what that hero's journey looks like, the interruption being Christ, God coming to us to carry us right home. We never have to make it on our own as it is, and really explored what it looked like then to understand the spiritual life as resting, as being, as sitting long enough to be found. A rather short journey after all. I speak about then the Incarnation making mystics of us all, and then the spiritual life becomes about waking up to what God has already done, rather than something we need to achieve. And so what I want to transition to this morning is the 4th chapter, which I've entitled We Are Legion. It is a chapter that I felt was important to write for a number of reasons. One is that throughout the history of Christianity, particularly the Christian contemplative tradition, beginning really in a more systematic or organized or institutional way in the Desert Mothers and Fathers, which has never been divorced from asceticism, a life of asceticism. So prayer and asceticism seem to go hand in hand throughout not only Christian tradition, but virtually every meditative tradition the world over. And asceticism is typically associated with those practices of self-denial, perhaps fasting, certain forms of, almsgiving, as we hear about during the context of Lent and so on. And I think that there's 2 things worth saying as we start the conversation around asceticism this morning. Is one, that it's been my impression that the idea of asceticism is underdeveloped within the context of the modern Christian contemplative movement, even say within contemplative outreach. There's a lot of focus on practice, on sitting, on prayer, on meditation, but less theological development around how that connects to asceticism. And I thought it was important for us to have that sort of ameliorated on some level, which is what I'm doing with my final with my 4th chapter. I also think that there is a profound misunderstanding of what asceticism is. We typically associate it with extreme, bizarre tendencies of self-denial or self-punishment or bodily abuse on some level. And I think that while the history of Christian tradition certainly has seen those moments of extremes, that the vast majority of Christian tradition has been very moderate around ascetical practice and level-headed and reasonable, that there has been more or less a sense in which there's something worth considering here. If we're going to speak, as we do, about the value of an incarnate faith, then the body has all to do with our spirituality, and asceticism has all to do really with the body-mind-heart connection. Some of you may have heard of, for example, extreme practices of medieval monks sleeping in their coffins to remind themselves of their mortality. I don't advise you try this at home. Or, extended periods of sleep deprivation that would lead to sort of some sort of hallucinatory visions and so on. And that is not where I want to take our conversation today. Part of what I talk about throughout this particular chapter is what's known as the royal way, which was a way within the ancient Near East that was widely traveled, usually for commerce and so on. And so we adopt that idea, much the way we hear in Buddhism of the middle way. Some of you may know that the Buddha went through all kinds of practices of extremity, realizing that it's all just too much and ultimately not helpful. A lot of the ascetical practices, I think the church has learned, don't make people holy, they just make them grumpy. So the idea is, how do we find kind of that balance to what it is we're seeking? So one of the first things I do in this chapter is question the ancient tradition of referring within Christianity to asceticism as a way of grappling with our demons. And I pose toward the beginning of the chapter whether that kind of language in a more scientific age is still valuable. I conclude that it is, and I'll try to explain why by reading for you sort of my opening paragraphs of chapter 4, which begins on page 93. The quote I used to start this chapter in the little subheading comes from a gloss of Isaiah 14:12, which reads, "Oh, how fallen you are from heaven, day star, son of the dawn. Oh, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low." We see here this idea that is taken up in the book of Revelation of Satan during that great primordial battle, being thrown out of heaven and seen sort of falling from heaven like a flash of lightning in this sort of cosmic battle between the angels of light and the angels of darkness. And this sort of sets the stage again for a kind of primordial or even mythical context in which we understand this cosmic battle between good and evil underway. And that battle has multiple levels, the inner spiritual battles that we have to face, and when we don't, how those battles are necessarily fought in families, communities, neighborhoods, nations, and the globe. So in many ways, we'll see that asceticism is a kind of call to arms to fight the demons within rather than those without. We see this really poignantly in John's Gospel in the 8th chapter, where Jesus enters in solidarity a circle of judgment, and one could hear in this microcosm really of his whole ministry. He enters the circle of judgment of a woman accused for committing adultery, where she is about to be stoned, and we should not underestimate the danger he put himself in when an angry mob who feels justified in the murder of this woman are all holding stones and ready to cast them. But he enters into this place of judgment, right? This is really what the whole Incarnation is about, really entering the violence of human history and the judgment of it. And he also announces then what we might think of as a call to arms, which is let the one, right, who has no sin throw the first stone. This is a call to arms because it's asking us to look first within at our own grappling with demons before we project judgment on others. And this is a practice of asceticism. And it takes, by the way, to hearken something I was saying yesterday, it takes us a healthy ego to be able to do this. Those of us who have frail egos don't have the capacity to do the inner work of recognizing the way in which each of us can be judgmental or the way we can be tyrants. And we have seen throughout history how those with fragile egos could cast themselves as victims when in fact they are the tyrants. This is a consistent theme throughout history. Okay, so so the inner work and the requirement for a healthy ego is central here. This is what I mean to distinguish ego from false self. And so as Jesus enters this circle of judgment, he manages to get people to look within themselves. And when they do, they all put their stones down and they walk away. Now, there's a beautiful exchange here, because what Jesus does is to really give a context in which we recognize our own, nobody's riding a high moral horse. None of us have the capacity or really ability in fairness to judge another person. And so he looks around and he says to this woman, "Has no one judged you?" And she says, "No, my Lord, no one." And it's important that what follows is when he says, "Then neither do I." Right? Now, at this point, though, there is also a kind of a transition in the story where he says to her, "Now, go home and don't do that anymore." Now, his admonishment to her is not one grounded in judgment. This is key. It is grounded in him recognizing her as a child of God for whom the behavior of adultery is beneath her. Right? You're above this. This behavior is beneath you. So go home and don't do this. So there is both a call for non-judgment in her community, but also a raising up of her precisely not because she's being judged, but out of a place of love and recognizing her own dignity. All of us know the difference between being in a community where we're feeling judged and how that restricts us and kind of ties us up versus one in which we feel a kind of intimate acceptance and openness where we're really allowed to start to be ourselves again. And this is what he's looking at. And so the whole point of the ascetical life, and this will become important for us to remember, I'll reiterate it in a bit. Asceticism and athleticism actually share the same root word, but their intentions, their goals are entirely opposite. The athlete, as it were, is training in order to succeed. The ascetic is training in order to learn what it means to fail. And the reason for that is because all of our efforts, our fasting, and all the things that we might sort of do to bring ourselves into a life of virtue will inevitably fail. Think about Romans 7, right? I'm going to try my best to do this, right? But there's those Flintstone vitamins tempting me again, and eventually I succumb. So the whole idea of asceticism is not, and this is key, not to prove ourselves worthy, right? Not to make ourselves worthy, which is that perennial temptation, right, that we all grapple with, the feeling of unworthiness. It's really to demonstrate the extent to which I can't make myself worthy. There is nothing that I need to do to make myself worthy, and that worthiness really has nothing to do with it. It's really to prove our incapacity to save ourselves. And so in that sense, it becomes, I think, a practice of the reclamation of beauty. Phil Oakes, for those of you who remember him in the 60s, the songwriter, he said, "In a world of ugliness, the only protest is beauty." And this is really what asceticism is about and what I'd like to help unfold for you so you know what I mean by that this morning. So if you open with me to page 93, I'd like to just begin with my opening lines here, a couple of paragraphs, because it will help to set the stage for where I'm trying to go with this. By the way, one of the interesting things about writing a book is I could literally spend days on one paragraph, like torturing myself over it. It's horrible. And then at the end of that, at the end of those 3 days, I take a break and then I go back and I look at it and I think, this is the worst thing ever put on paper. This is horrible and I need to start over. Okay, there is one exception in this entire book where I didn't feel that way. And that is the opening line of this chapter where I thought, that's a cool line. So I kept it. And here's the line. I am not sure whether demons actually exist, but I do know this, they are real. I mean, that's a cool line right there. Okay. So I'm going to show you what that means now. Okay. So whether they inhabit us as addictions, attachments, or entrenched patterns of self-destruction, whether they impose themselves on us as depression, anxiety, anger, lust, greed, or lukewarm complacency. None of us have been spared the struggle against demons, not even Christ. Despite medieval depictions of of serpents and dragons, horrid beasts and gaping jaws. Most often the demons who assail us do not appear ugly or frightening to behold. Quite the contrary. They are beautiful, seductive, and glimmer with an enticing allure, at least upon first sight. Lucifer, let us not forget, means light bearer, and who among us is not drawn to the light? Enter temptation. Like moths fluttering ever closer to the flame, we do not fly headlong into the fire, but toy with it, drawn in by its seductive glow, until in one irresistible moment we are consumed by the very thing we ourselves desired to consume. There is a lesson here in the stillness of the flame and the sporadic flight of the moth. Not all our demons stalk us. They do not have to. They have honed the virtue of patience as well as any saint. They glow gently with infinite equanimity until just the right moment, our weakest. And then, with the subtle venom of suggestion, they whisper softly and with unerring precision exactly what we need to hear. So the Epistle of James, where he quotes, "One is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then, when that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death." The serpent of Eden, after all, led an entire race into the illusion of sin and death with little more than a whisper. Our temptations come in the guise of many forms and faces, each designed with meticulous calculation to strike the Achilles heel of even the most virtuous among us. These are our demons, and they are legion, yet no matter their countenance, they share but one tail. So there is a mildly creepy way to begin our struggle with asceticism, but I'm hoping that in that description you recognize something there within your own life experience. A few things to unpack here that I think are important. If we don't grapple with these so-called demons, then they will certainly wreak havoc on us in ways that are less than conscious for us. And I argue in just a few chapters from now that the value of speaking still in our rather scientifically minded, empirical minded world, of speaking of demons, is because it names them and gives us the capacity to name those aspects of ourselves that feels otherwise alien or incongruous with who we are or who we want to be. One of the beautiful things that we see throughout the history of the interpretation of the Gospels, especially around exorcisms, particularly in Mark's Gospel, Jesus performs what is in Mark 5, one of the most elaborate exorcisms in all of the New Testament, with a lot of sort of gory detail, which is where I take the name of this chapter. There is a man in Gennesaret, which is in the Decapolis, so in the Gentile region, just what we would say to the east of Galilee. And there he encounters this man who is chained up, who is in so much psychological agony that he's cutting himself with stones. He's wailing day and night. He's out of his mind. He's breaking through the chains. He's living in the tombs. And we have to understand that the imagery here of living among the dead says something about the impact of the demonic on us. It segregates us from healthy, integral relationships. It segregates us from society. It isolates us. That's what our demons do. They isolate us. And so when Jesus finally confronts this demon, one of the things he does is he demands its name. What is your name? And of course, the response that comes is both creepy, but also telling. We are legion, for we are many. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know this, but a legion is essentially what the Roman Empire called about 6,000 troops. That's a lot of military power. And so to say we are legion is quite literally demonizing the empire, right? It's like saying, we are Navy men, or we are Marines when you're referring to the United States, that would be telling to anybody who's hearing that story and making that association about the Roman military. And so it also speaks to the idea that, well, there's not just one of us in here. There's a whole party going on, right? Which really establishes a sense of how much agony this man is in. And of course, they begin, ironically, to pray to God that in God's name, do not send us outside the district, which means outside the neighborhoods where there is population into the empty desert. Does anybody know why they don't want to be sent into the desert? Because it's miserable, and they don't like it any more than we do. That's essentially what it comes down. But more to the point, it's that there's no people. You see, this is just it. They're parasitic, as we'll talk about in a moment. Demons need the host, right, to do the dirty work of demons. And so Jesus makes a kind of plea bargain with them and sends them instead, of course, into this whole herd of pigs. That right there is telling that we are clearly outside Jewish territory, where there would, of course, be no pig farmers. And so into the pigs go these many demons who then, we are told, throw themselves off a cliff and get drowned in the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. I've been there, by the way. I took students. There's no cliff. Number one. It's a slope. So they all, as far as I'm concerned, went swimming for a while and came back afterwards. But this is how stories can get embellished. But in any case, they leap off and they all sort of drown. And that brings those demons back into the world of chaos, right? That harkens back to the primordial waters of chaos, out of which creation comes and subdues them in that process. Now, what we see in this is this man now is found shortly after, dressed appropriately, in his right mind, no longer in agony. And he says to Jesus, "Can I follow you along the way?" Of course, this is what Christians were called until that time in Antioch around the 80s or so, when they took on the name Christian. So followers of the way means disciples. And he says to him, "No, I need you to go to the Decapolis and tell them everything that you have seen and heard." And he becomes a disciple to the Gentiles, as it were, early on. So that later in Mark's gospel, when Jesus returns to that territory, he is sort of swamped by people who now want healing and so forth. The beauty here, again, is that here, a man who had been isolated, but is now liberated from those demons, is reintegrated with society, becomes a disciple, right? Is able to be put in service of the gospel. When we think about the ways in which our own demons assail us, much of this story actually unfolds similarly. Any of you who are familiar with a 12-step program or something like that would know that whenever a member speaks openly, they begin by naming the demon, right? "Hi, my name is Tom, and I'm an alcoholic." There you have it. You've named the demon, because in naming it, you disempower it. In naming it, it can't continue to do its work unawares. So by the constant repetition of naming that demon is how we have control over it. It's exactly what Jesus did. And frankly, for those of you who know anything about the rite of exorcism, it demands that the priest name the demon or get the demon to name itself. This is a common trope. So naming our demons is key to the ascetical life for the purpose of finding freedom from them. Right? Calling them out from the dark places.